Great.
Good. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second webinar that Sharon has done for us since I'll say the start of the summer, even though we know the official start of summer was Friday. But since the start of the summer, and we really appreciate all of her efforts to help us with our evaluation of our prevention efforts, especially today as we talk about evaluating the outcomes of campus-based prevention efforts. So before I turn it over to Sharon to get started, I just ask that if you have not been able to mute your phone or your computer, please do so. I'll mute you from my end as I am able. We are recording this webinar today, so if you yourself or anybody else at your campus would like a copy, please email me afterwards, and I'll be happy to send it to them. As well as if you have any questions for Sharon throughout the presentation, there should be a chat room that you can pull up on your screen. Just encourage you to send those questions to the group or to me, and I'll be sure to relay this to Sharon when she feels is appropriate in her presentation and when she has a chance to take a breath. Other than that, if you have a phone or an iPad or anything similar that you're working from while also listening in on this webinar today, I just ask that you keep it away from those devices. We have had some issues in the past with some feedback and interference with the presentation. So as best you can, please keep those items away. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Sharon. Thank you again, Sharon, for doing this for us.
Absolutely happy to do it. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you to all of you, whoever and wherever you may be, for making time in your day to come in and listen to something I love to talk about. So this is really exciting to talk about evaluating prevention efforts across multiple campuses in Ohio. Although I do hope that the information I'm here to share will be valuable to anyone who finds themselves here. My intended audience is campuses participating in the ODHE Changing Campus Culture Initiative. So I've been really fortunate to work with many campuses across the state, an amazing collective effort here in Ohio. And so I'm hoping this will be useful to all of you. I work with some great partners in the state, including some friends I think are on the line, including Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence and other campuses that I've gotten to know in several contexts. So Carrie, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to overview today's webinar. It was really hard to organize around learning objectives, although I know that's best practice. I do come from an education background like many of you. It's just a little bit of time to talk about a huge field. So this is what I did. I kind of said, where are the things I can do in an hour? So the first thing is I want to talk about integrating evaluation procedures. So I'm going to emphasize that verb. Wherever you may be in your work to end sexual violence, it's important to start building evaluative thinking and data use into whatever it is that you're doing. So the second thing is this focus on outcomes. And in focusing on outcomes today, I need to say how very important process evaluation is. You cannot interpret any outcome evaluation or take action on your findings without process evaluation. So if I were to come in and do a training series on evaluation, I would absolutely start with process evaluation. If you were to think about bringing an evaluator, or if I were lucky enough to be hired by any one of you to be an evaluation consultant for you, I would start with process. But in this context of a short lunchtime webinar where the audience is comprised of folks from different community settings, we do share a common goal, the elimination of sexual violence, more so than common activities or common methods. So that's why this talk is focusing there, not necessarily because it's any more or less important than process evaluation. I just wanted to say that. And then the last thing is really think of anything I offer here as a sampler. This is the tapas of the wonderful menu of evaluation activities that are out there. Let's start with a definition, a couple definitions on this next slide. So you'll see the little header at the top. That's going to show you I'm on my first agenda item. I've talked a little bit about integration. Now I want to say, what is evaluation? There's a couple of different, there's many definitions of evaluation, right? But I put up a couple that I like. So if we start by, I'd like to draw your attention to the second bullet point that says evaluation involves collecting data to enhance knowledge and decision making. And I love this because, again, I'm really into that actionable piece. And you may say to yourself, especially if you're an Ohio-based campus, well, we're doing these climate surveys, we're collecting data. Isn't that evaluation? And my answer to that is kind of yes and no. So it kind of depends. And this is where I have you look at the first definition, first bullet point here, is that evaluation is more than just collecting data and looking at a report. It's a systematic process to determine merit, worth, value, or significance. And now I'll draw you down to the last bullet point there, which is that the root of evaluation is values, and your evaluation procedures need to build space and create a setting where you can use data to discuss those values and set milestones for yourself and move towards that mission-driven, value-based work. That's going to look different on every one of your campuses. So the idea here is that, yes, we're doing amazing work in Ohio by kind of providing resources and some common tools for collecting benchmark and climate survey data, but each of you can start to integrate additional evaluation procedures. So let's take a look at the next slide. Again, evaluation has multiple purposes. I like to always make sure that when we collect data, we can serve more than one purpose. Today's talk is really aimed towards the purpose of showcasing success. So as a basic researcher, as someone who is trained in research methods where the idea was to, generate science or create a knowledge base, that is not necessarily the goal of the work that I try to help campuses do with evaluation. So the goal here really is to find out where are those pieces of things that you're doing that you can elevate and use to continue the momentum of the work. So overall, this slide with its header of what is success is a little bit of a tease because that answer is going to be unique. Again, you're going to have to create that process with your evaluation stakeholders. Every campus will need to answer, what does prevention success look like? Your answers will all be unique. From my perspective, working with state level partners, the answer to that is continued momentum of prevention program. Towards that end, which is my end, I'm going to always be working with campuses to figure out what are the things that are valuable? What are the things that are significant? In that process, I've never failed once to also find a place to say, this isn't working so great. We need to make improvements here. But generally, my answer and the way that I approach my work is towards this end, and it's important that people know that that's what I bring to the work when I engage with you all. That the answer to what is success for me is that campuses would see the ongoing value of addressing, and dismantling the root causes of sexual violence and continue allocating resources toward that end. On your campus, it may be more students engage in active bystander intervention, and that brings us to what do I mean when I say programming? So every campus is doing prevention activities. Whether or not that has risen to, the standard of primary prevention program is a matter of semantic, that's an empirical question that researchers like to discuss. What is a program? So I do want to say it is important to kind of have a common understanding of what program is if you're moving towards evaluating it. A program is a combination of several complementary prevention activities. So you have multiple things working together, designed to deliver reinforcing messages to one or more populations, whether that be your Greeks, your athletes, your faculty, your staff, your students, your alumni, in a variety of different settings. So an example of a program that many of us are familiar with would be Green Dot. So that includes bystander education activities for students, complemented by community mobilization activities that reach out across the campus to all kinds of groups, engaging folks as allies in prevention. And then our gold standard really is comprehensive programming, which is more than one program operating at multiple levels of the socio-ecological model on the same campus. So if we look at the next slide, everybody's going to be at different places along this programming continuum. This slide and other slides that have the dark background on it that you view today come from that first webinar that Carrie referenced at the top of this talk, which was entitled Turning Upstream. And in that webinar, I introduced the concept of a prevention tipping point. So we know that change is not linear. And within campuses that are doing this work, you'll work and work and work. Often those first years are hard. You may not see your bubble. You're working to heat things up, but you're not yet seeing the bubbles, or it's hard to see that. Eventually, things do kind of pick up, and it sort of follows this flow conceptually. The box that I've marked off there is kind of where you want to start to think about evaluation, outcome evaluation. And again, so many of you have been doing work against sexual misconduct for many years. I know that the Changing Campus Culture Initiative is entering like third, fourth year. We're somewhere in this. But again, in terms of outcome evaluation, when did you start doing primary prevention activities? And that's kind of what I'm talking about here, is where your outcome evaluation for primary prevention. And you want to start getting into outcome evaluation somewhere between your third and fifth year of doing primary prevention programming. That's why that definition of program is important. And I want to talk about a couple tools that you can do to kind of get yourself to that point. If you're not there, get your campus to that point, or assess where your campus is. So if you advance to the next slide, the first thing I want to direct you towards is this amazing little workbook that is created for and with prevention champions, folks that have been doing this work for a long time. So it's available both in digital and hard copy version at the web link from Strategic Prevention Solutions here. And these are the folks that kind of came up with that prevention tipping point analogy as well. If you advance to the next slide, Carrie, I've stolen, or I haven't stolen, because you will see the little copyright disclaimer at the bottom. I have borrowed and reprinted with consent from my friends at Strategic Prevention Solutions a little rubric for helping you think about where to focus your evaluation strategies. So as I mentioned, process evaluation is really important. It's hard to talk about with a diverse group because everybody's activities are different. But all of your prevention activities should have a process evaluation, whether that means you're just tracking how many people showed up, how many invites you sent out, your own internal tracking. That is process evaluation, satisfaction surveys, sign-in sheets, all those kinds of things count as process evaluation. Whether you do an outcome evaluation and what that outcome evaluation looks like depends on your resources. So again, the idea here is that as you build up from activities to strategic primary prevention goals, to programs that do that thing I talked about as a definition of program, where you have complementary messages working together, reinforcing ideas across multiple settings, to eventually to that comprehensive program. Your evaluation work will grow and expand and evolve as well. So just a concept, a little plug from that that handbook that I think is really useful. I want to revisit or reintroduce, and you can kind of move through this quickly, Carrie, but I just want to introduce the idea of the turning upstream self-assessment to try to get a gauge of where you are and some ideas on how to get to that point. This was a tool that I developed and presented back in May. So it helps you gauge where you are in terms of prevention. And even by looking at kind of these qualitative anchor points, you can get a sense of what you need to do to get to that next, to get towards those darker teal boxes, which is, you know, more and more comprehensive prevention. So that tool is available from me, from Carrie, probably from, well, let me just leave it at those two. You can get that from me or Carrie. And again, the idea is that you can figure out how programmatic the prevention work that you're doing is. Pause here for a moment. So at the bottom, it talks about useful data to action processes. And so again, you're going to see that as you get towards the higher end, more comprehensive work, the evaluation procedures will also get more and more advanced. But at the very least, you should be doing evaluation of training and outreach work. All right, moving on to our second focus, which is outcomes. I want to provide a real simple definition. So what are outcomes? They're observed changes that happen as a result of implementing prevention activities. When you're collecting data on outcomes, you should also be collecting data on program processes so that you have information to go back to and interpret your results. If something bombed, you can go back and look at why. If something was really great, you can go back and look at why. And the best case scenario is when you have both of those things occur and you can kind of compare and contrast and try to learn. Can advance to the next slide. I'm going to do a little overview, again, focusing on outcomes. These are changes or improvements. They're specified a little more. Goals may often look like activities. Outcomes really need to be the changes that you'd like to see as a result of the work that you're doing. These changes, I'm looking at the second bullet point now, can be at the individual level in terms of learning. That, again, is going to happen starting with individuals, but you can measure group learning. You can measure community knowledge. So changes can be at that level, learning, action, or conditions. And then the next thing I want to talk about is expressing those outcomes as short-term, mid-term, and long-term changes. So if we advance to the next slide, it's really helpful to think about in terms of expect, want, and hope. And so the short-term outcomes are those changes in specific behavior, skills, behavioral intentions, knowledge, attitude, awareness. Again, often at the individual level with prevention work is the way we do it. It doesn't have to be that way, but at the campus level, this is probably where I direct you. Midterm outcomes, again, this is the change you want to occur after that. These can be expressed as kind of thinking about checkpoints on the road to reaching the long-term impact. They can be practices, policies, and procedural changes that occur over time. So as an example, as you make the move, maybe your short-term outcome is to raise awareness of prevention programs to the same level where awareness of response programs are on your campus. And so maybe a midterm outcome is that definitions of primary prevention become written into your sexual misconduct policies. Often we don't have a definition of what primary prevention is, while we may have good definitions of what sexual misconduct is, what confidentiality means, some of these other important things. As we make movement to include primary prevention with the response work we're doing, maybe you want to see that reflected in your policies. Long-term outcomes can be expressed as changes in the overall problem. So I think, again, why I'm focusing on outcomes in this conversation is because all of us on this call, I'm presuming, I would like to think that all of us on this call hope to achieve a reduction, if not an elimination, of sexual misconduct on Ohio campuses. That's our hope. We share that as a long-term outcome. Sometimes this is called impact. We also probably share a long-term outcome that students, staff, and faculty increase their, share a mutual responsibility towards ending sexual misconduct. So those are the kinds of long-term outcomes that I think we all bring to the table. The hardest one often when I'm working with clients to figure out is want. And, I think that's kind of how we are in life too. It's easy to talk about your hopes and dreams because they're so distant. It's sometimes easy to talk about your expectations for the day. Your to-do list for today is easier to make than that. And that 5-year plan is sometimes hard. Like, you want your kids to have a happy life. And, today that means you have to, and this is my real life, actually, my real life to do today means I have to take my son as soon as this is over to go get his sports physical for trying out for soccer. So the short-term expectations I have of myself as a parent and my long-term goal, that's easy. Where should he go to college? Like some of these things in the middle are harder. So that's pretty common to the process. I want to normalize that. I'm now going to provide you a whole series of lots of different potential outcomes, not to overwhelm, but to make a final point. So all of these outcomes that are on the screen were brainstormed by that Strategic Prevention Solutions group that I've kind of plugged a couple times. I work with them closely on a number of projects. They've put a lot of thought into this. All of these are completely reasonable hopes, expectations that you should have if your prevention program is working. If we look at, just quickly, or give yourself a 5-count, Carrie, and just go through the next few slides until we get to the last dark colored one. All of these other things on these other slides that Carrie's going to present come from the technical package to prevent sexual violence from the CDC, which is a national leader for us. And they are also very valid, important outcomes. And these are organized around different strategies or different programs that you might develop. And the important thing is that you determine with your stakeholders on your campus what the outcomes you want your prevention programming to achieve, because there's lots of ways of getting there. So let's pause here for a minute. Really, really important thing, almost more important with prevention evaluation than anything else. Again, I would feel reasonably confident coming up here and telling you what your outcome should be for the work that you do with survivors. I certainly would need to consult people from groups, social identity groups that I don't belong to make sure that, but I feel like I could do that. Your prevention evaluation outcomes are going to be different, and they have to start with a collaborative process. So it's a collaborative process, and the outcome, or the result of that process, the output, let me get technical in my language, of that process needs to be a guiding document that your team can kind of hang on to. So whether it looks like a logic model or a theory of change or a strategic plan or a prevention plan or a work plan or a 5-year vision board, whatever you want to call it, and whatever process you want to use to get there, that needs to happen, and that needs to happen, even if your team is really small, even if you're 2 people, or some people say, oh, it's just me. Well, then it's you and you find a consultant. It's you and one other critical friend, but it can't be done alone, and it's certainly not something Carrie or myself can hand down to you. I want to highlight another resource that's out there. This was a tip sheet that was created at the end of last year's climate surveying, and I bring that in as a piece of the context because that's work that I'm familiar with, and it's work that I feel like we have a common base in. So some of your outcomes could come from this sheet, but your process indicators are going to be different. So let's start to talk about that. So let's move to the next slide, as you started to do, Carrie. And I want to start to talk about the important piece. And thank you for bearing with me with all of that. I know that I've used half our time, and people are saying, get to it. But all that stuff is important. All right. So here it is, prevention evaluation design. The best designs collect data from both process and outcome. It's never going to be possible to collect data about everything you do, so you have to prioritize the most important components. That comes out of the process I just talked about, and once you've done that, specify evaluation indicators. Next slide, what are indicators? Well, this is a specific observable marker of prevention, implementation, or results. It often looks like a data point. This might be a number, right? So the terms indicator, metric, and measure are often used interchangeably, and I think about them I use them somewhat differently, but they're all kind of the same thing, which is a data collection. So it's a reporting rate. It's the number of employees that are trained on your campus. It's usually a number. Good evaluations include single item indicators, and these indicators can measure both inputs, which is the contributions that enable a program to be implemented, your funding, your staff, your key partners, infrastructure. A lot of that stuff is measured in that turning upstream document. That would be one way you could start to turn the observations of your campus into indicators, would be to use that tool, turning upstream, to kind of measure use that to measure your input indicators. What are the resources you have available to you towards prevention? The next slide will show you that indicators can also are process measures of process. So it looks like we may be on a lag, but these are things that measure. Here we are, program activities and outputs. Together, these measures will indicate whether the program is being implemented as planned. So how many minutes did it take? How many people showed up? What was the gender breakdown? How many of the curriculum sessions did you implement? Did you do all the activities as they were stated? All that kind of bean counting. Again, that stuff is really important in figuring out how a program achieved its outcomes, if it did. I have a couple of visuals to kind of bring this home. So in this analogy of cooking, which a lot of people use with evaluation, the inputs are those resources that go in. All of, tracking all your other process and activity indicators kind of say what you did with those resources. And I just want to talk about, the knife there, how sharp it is. That may be how well your implementation staff is trained, and it's really going to make a difference as people get more and more knowledge and training and expertise. As that knife gets sharpened, your work's going to be easier and more effective. So, thinking about how much training your program staff, that's not necessarily an outcome that most people are going to, that you're not going to put in a report. Well, maybe you should, but it's not what most people are going to expect to read in a report, but it's really important process evaluation. So think about, how to operationalize that stuff. What you will often see the most of is performance indicators. So this is the results or the outputs of the program activities. And so again, the analogy here is like the presentation of this lovely pasta dinner. And whereas an input measures how much spaghetti went in there, or pasta went into it, you may measure how much is left on the plate as an indicator of how good or not good that was. And when we do our work, a lot of the performance indicators that are really important focus around engagement and satisfaction. So these are things that you would capture in a survey that would tell you how good that program, the perception of how good that program was. So if somebody were to rate how good this pasta dinner was, they give it 5 out of 5 stars. That would be similar to the kind of process evaluation you might collect that says, how much did you enjoy this bystander intervention workshop? And if your staff rated how engaged the audience was, that might be another performance indicator. Really, really critical, useful, helpful information internally. All right, let's talk a little bit about outcome indicators. This is whether or not the program is achieving those expected changes in the short, immediate, and long term. Next slide. So this is really important. It's not that plate of pasta, and it's really easy and really important to get caught up in how good that smelled and tasted and looked and how much people enjoyed it. But what we're talking about with outcomes is the changes that can be observed after folks have consumed your program activities and prevention messages. Again, not how much they clapped at the end of hearing a talk, but when they walked away, and again, going with my silly analogy here, did people say, oh my God, that tomato was so good, I'm now going to, integrate tomatoes into my diet? Is there a lowered blood pressure, stronger feelings of, so again, these can happen across a spectrum, but it's really the changes as a result of that. And both of those things are important, right? Like capturing what that plate of pasta looks like and then whether it had the effect. Because if you generate stronger feelings of love for the cook, you're certainly going to want to know, hey, what was your recipe? What did you put in there? And you need to document that in the form of process evaluation. Next slide. All right. So that was 4 minutes because I was feeling like really rushed, and this is the part that I want to get into. I will pause now. I'm going to take a sip from my drink. Carrie, if there's any questions that have come in, if you want to let me know. If anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, this is a break.
So I think specific to your presentation thus far, I have not seen any questions come in yet relevant to the content. If anybody does have anything, just a reminder that you can put it in the chat box and we will get to it at one of these breaks. So I would just go ahead, Sharon, at this point.
Great. So what's important when designing your actual evaluation? So now I'm going to talk about, we've got this conceptual idea of we're collecting data. We want to know both about the program activities, the inputs, the outputs, and then, these outcome changes are so important. I'm a change maker. That's what I care about. In order to be able to talk about change, you need to know how you're going to analyze your data before you collect it. So sometimes it's really easy to get sucked up into, oh my God, I found this awesome survey. Look how great these questions are. I really think that these are meaningful. We care about this. You need to know how you're going to use those numbers to illustrate change. And that's only going to be possible if you think about that before you collect your data. So I want to talk about the big designs that I think are appropriate for most of the campuses that I've worked with. So the first would be, and again, this is outcome evaluation. So all that exciting stuff about process stuff that I really get into, we need to put that aside and realize now that we're talking about outcome evaluation. And in my mind, I'm thinking about your students who have sat through some type of prevention activity. I'm thinking kind of curriculum-based, whatever it might be, and you are going to ask your students or your faculty or your staff or whoever it is to give you some information about now their attitudes, their behaviors, their intentions, whatever it might be, however you've defined your outcomes. The post-only design is great. You collect data once at the end of your program. This is really great for shorter duration programs. Again, in order for this to have any meaning at all, you need to set a standard of what you want to see ahead of time. So the next slide will give an example of that. And I'm pulling, I've kind of doctored data a little bit, like here, this is direct data pulled from the statewide climate survey results, so it might look familiar to some of you. I changed satisfaction with response and satisfaction with outcome of campus response to talk about workshop content and workshop delivery. The important thing here is you're going to get data at the end, so it's going to be that 3.3 and the 3.5, and you're going to be able to explain it no matter, there's going to be a way to explain those data post hoc. Oh, the presenter was sick, or however, but what's important is that ahead of time you say, we want to achieve a 4. Our goal is that our standard of success, again, going back to that question of what does success look like, is a 4. So now if you have a 3.5 and a 3.3, it's no longer about like, oh, why one's a little bit high. I mean, you're still going to talk about why one's a little bit higher than the other, but your point is going to be, and this shouldn't say student survivors, your point is still students were less satisfied with our bystander education workshops than we had hoped they would be. Now you turn back to your team and you can have a value-based discussion about this. Like, are our expectations too unreasonable? Like, do we need to lower that bar? Or do we now have an argument to go and say we need to get more training for our educators? Do we have an argument to say we need to kind of maybe revisit what this workshop content and delivery is? You have an actionable result now because of that red line that's drawn. So that red line is really important. And in a post-only design, I get from an evaluation procedures, not climate survey, but if this is happening within the context of values, you would have a outcome indicator an outcome statement that would have said, we want to see satisfaction at a 4.0 measured with these 2 specific indicators. That's post only, really useful. Next one. The other way you can talk about difference or change, so that is a difference between what you observed and what you had wanted to see. Another way of looking at difference or change and to drive change is to look at where your campus is vis-a-vis where some other comparison group is. Because resources are scarce in terms of time, money, mostly those 2, I've been trying to think about ways that you can use the ODHE benchmarks on the climate survey data. So this is another design. You could start to get some evaluative thinking using the data collection opportunity that already exists within the climate survey and ODHE benchmarks. If we look at this next slide, Carrie, and again, these might look familiar. The evaluand, that's your campus. That would be the pie chart in the lower right. So students were 25% of students were very satisfied or satisfied with the campus response to their report. That is actionable based on being able to compare it to some other group, in this case, all Ohio students that participated in the climate survey. So here you're able to say, well, 25%, you know, again, without having the comparison in the upper left, you could talk in circles around that. If you're comparing to some referent group, it's easy to say, oh my gosh, we really need to do better. It's more actionable. The next example is maybe you don't think that data is a good comparison group, and you're more interested in comparing students to employees on your own campus. This is another example that comes straight from the climate survey. So here, it's not a referent group, it's some other comparison group. And again, the key is that it's meaningful to you and your decision makers. I could fill in all kinds of different potential comparison groups. What's important is for you, who your evaluand is. Here at students, maybe in your case, it's comparing survivors to all other students, or students of color to other students of other ethnic minority backgrounds, or LGBTQ students to students with a straight orientation. So again, who your evaluand is and what that comparison group is meaningful to your campus decision makers. But that's a design that's pretty easy to pull in. The next design I want to talk about is time series designs. So this is when you collect data from the same population at different points in time. And so the pre-post design is an example of a time series design. Wait, can you go back? I don't want to look at this quite yet. Where in between point 1 and point 2, an intervention happens. That doesn't have to be the case. So your climate survey data, regardless of whether or not you're implementing, for example, Green Dot between 2018 and 2020, or whatever you might, you can still collect. This is a design where the idea is you're still collecting, you're taking the pulse on the same population at different points. Again, the pre-post is a specific example of a time series design in which you have the first time series and then intervention occurs and then the second time series. What's key about it is that you're using the exact same measures, worded the exact same ways, and using the same recruitment, i.e. sampling strategy at all those time series. Now let's take a look at the next example, and we're going to revisit this data again at the end. This is 2 years of programming that took place within middle schools. It was a social norms campaign. So what's important is the decrease that you see from the first point to the second point. And then again, there was a break, a new school year, summer happened, and then a new school year came in and the same intervention took place. So the intervention in the unwanted touching, as an example, the intervention would have been between the 50% of folks that experienced it, that's the blue dot in the upper left, who had experienced unwanted touching when they were surveyed in the fall, and that had gone down to 39%. And we'll talk about incidents in a moment. It was phrased within the past 30 days. The bottom line below that, and this is really important, is we also asked perpetration data. So while the top measures prevalence in terms of, or measures incidence of victimization, the bottom row is those same exact behaviors. Did you do this behavior? And that's something that as you do more prevention work, we need to start asking about perpetration and not just always asking about victimization. So this is a model of, you can ask the same questions. Did you experience this as a target? Did you do this as a responsible party. These are unmatched groups. Pre-post design and the retrospective pre-post. Let's take a look at those. This would just be 2 time points. So the next slide, you can advance, Carrie, will illustrate a pre-post. These are matched cases. So the other differentiation often with a pre-post design, which you're not going to be able to do with climate survey, is that you match individuals from pre to post. So whether it's with a name, a student ID, a randomly generated ID number, some sort of confidential ID number you have people make, there has to be a way of matching what person A said at pre to what person A said at post. So that's one of the key things on a pre-post design, is that you have to get, and the big learning skill that differentiates it from the climate survey data is you're really wanting to be able to match specific individuals from pre to post, and then seeing how your prevention messages targeted and focused on those specific people did or did not lead to change. The first one, okay, that's great. Let's move ahead. This is a retrospective pre-post design, and I want to pitch this because as you're beginning your evaluation work with your prevention programming, this saves you a lot of time, of the limited time you have access to students, faculty, or staff to do your prevention programming. And it also limits the expense of time in terms of matching up those surveys from pre to post. And so essentially what happens is it's a post-only design, in that you only collect data at that final session. So say you do 6 sessions where you're training peer educators and you want to know how you've changed those folks. At the end of your training, you would give them a survey that would look like what you see on the left, where you have your questions and you have them answer, and you give them directions to start with now, to start with the unshaded portion. You have the answer go through the entire, you don't do this row by row. And I showed this example because often what I'll do is I'll fold over that shaded component, and when I distribute it to folks, they have this document that's folded over, and all they see is the white boxes that say not at all, somewhat, very. After they fill out every question, then you go back and say, okay, where were you before, and have them fill that out. And then those data can be, and these data do actually match up. This is actually an evaluation of regional training on response that some of you on this call may have been on. In addition to those practical justifications, less of your program time filling out surveys, less of your staff time matching cases and entering data, which can be a massive headache, especially when you start collecting hundreds of cases. It does have measurement theory rationale as well. So this can help with ceiling effects, and it can help with response shift bias, which is essentially that phenomenon when people walk into the room thinking they know everything about gender, and then you teach them something and they say, oh my God, I guess I knew nothing about gender when I walked in here. So it addresses a lot of things, and it's one of my favorite methods for evaluation. The last design I think I want to talk about is, I'm not going to talk about experimental designs. I want to focus on quasi-experimental designs. Experimental designs are, if you're doing Green Dot, you want to leave that work probably to the folks that developed Green Dot. They will do the experimental design-based research on it. On your campus, you're probably going to want to work more within a quasi-experimental design frame. And the difference here is really about random selection. So an experimental design is built on a foundation of random assignment, and that's to distribute any type of bias or error. We know that bias exists in the world. We know that error exists in the work that we do. And the idea behind random assignment is that you can equally distribute that over your different groups if you randomly select people. Again, unless you're aiming to publish this in a scientific journal, it's not really worth the time and effort to do that in a evaluation of your prevention work. I am starting to think some of you may want to consider random selection for your climate surveys, but in terms of experimental design, what the randomization we're talking about is that each person has an equal chance of either receiving your prevention or not. And in the real world, we don't do things that way. There's high risk groups that may need prevention more than others. So let me just stop at that because I could talk forever, and let's look at what quasi-experimental design is. This is an example where we're looking at reducing sexual harassment in middle schoolers, and we had 2 schools that agreed to participate in the intervention, and one was our high dosage, high program school, that's BHHS, Braddock Hills. They're high schools, that's right, high school. And the comparison school was one that just got the in-classroom training. They didn't get the social norms marketing component. So this is non-equivalent groups. It wasn't randomly determined which of those schools would do which. It was like the one school that was like really interested in partnering and willing to put in all the extra work, got the social norms marketing. The other one just got the, in-class training delivered. And so this would be a non-equivalent group. You could then at the end compare how folks did. And interestingly, here you'll see this isn't all the outcomes that we looked at, but in terms of some of these outcomes, the comparison school actually did a little better, right? So maybe that classroom component was enough to drive these particular outcomes. Again, this is one page of like an 80-page report. So the social norms marketing did have an effect, but the in-class component also worked. Here you can see the comparison school, especially on talking to a trusted adult, did a little better. So that's non-equivalent groups where you have 2 separate settings. You can kind of trick, you're probably not going to be able to find a campus that says, hey, we're going to do this thing on our campus, and how about if you do nothing, and at the end we'll compare our climate surveys. And I mean, maybe you would. Maybe that's something we should think about, is how to organize and set up those kind of partnerships across the state. But that's probably not going to happen in the near future. What you could do, and what we did do, and what you did see on your, so that first design was a non-equivalent comparison group. We specifically found a school that was similar to the other one, and we're able to compare. In this quasi-experimental design, this is just non-equivalent groups, you ask people, did you receive, in this case, training? And then you look at differences based on people. So this is correlational research. You're not ahead of time saying these people are going to get this intervention, these people are going to get something different. That's a stronger design. If you can't do that, you could at least say, kind of post hoc, did you get training versus did you not, and then look at some differences. And so this is a real world example that comes from climate surveys. I don't know whose campus it was, I just kind of picked it randomly, where the question was asked, did you receive prevention training? Some students said yes, some said no. We looked at differences on knowledge. Oh my gosh, I forgot this whole section was coming up, and now there's 4 minutes. Okay, so the one thing that we do share is a goal in reducing sexual misconduct. This is an outcome we care about in terms of selecting your indicators, how you're going to measure that. There's some movement that I want you to start thinking about as you do more and more prevention work. So specifically, I want people to start moving away from definitional-based indicators of sexual misconduct towards behavioral indicators. If you want to showcase success of prevention, people need to start thinking more about incidence versus prevalence and perpetration versus victimization, and I have some examples of that. So let's start with definitional indicators of sexual misconduct. This should look really familiar because these are prevalence questions. They're definitional. So in this case, people are asked, since coming to campus, have you ever experienced any of these things? And in theory, anytime we survey them that they're a student on that campus, the answer should remain the same. The difference in incidents is that you would say in the last 6 months, in the last 30 days, in the last 1 year, or since May of 2019, however you define your time period. Incidence questions ask about just a particular period of time. Then a definition is presented and people say yes or no. And so here's what you'll remember from climate surveys. The alternative to that on the next slide is to ask behaviorally specific items in an incidence format. And so in this case, you could ask this either prevalence or incidence, and it's really the question stem, whether or not you're saying, since you first came to XYZ campus, have you experienced the following, versus since fall of last year. And it's that piece of the question that differentiates incidence from prevalence. What I'm asking you to look at here is the difference between definitions and behaviors. So in this case, instead of giving 4 definitions, there were a list of very specific behaviors that were given, and then people said how many times, how many incidents did they experience. So it's that question stem piece that I described, and then the fact that we're measuring how many times it occurred instead of just yes, no, that makes it incidents. I'm rushing a little bit, so I don't expect that you would understand this totally. But the key that I want you to look at is that no matter how good those definitions are, and I highlight intimate partner violence because it was a really good definition. I mean, the language is up there. This is a campus that asked all of their students the same, this definitional question and then the behavioral question, same students. On the prevalence question, it was 6%. On some of these behavioral indicators, it was up to more than 3 times as high for shouted, yelled, insulted me, or swore at me. And again, verbal abuse is defined over there on the right. But people don't always read through those definitions. I'm not exactly sure why these numbers are so different. I just know this is a common thing. It's a measurement thing across surveys, across contexts. Your behaviorally specific measures are always going to give you more granular data. The reason you want more detailed granular data is because if you're trying to prevent IPV, as an example, you want more room to work with. Like so you want to have that more detailed 21% incidence so you can bring that down. It's hard to bring down a 6% prevalence rate because even if you stopped IPV in its tracks, those 6% of people that were victims last year, if they're still on your campus, they remain survivors today. Really important with doing prevention evaluation, you've got to use behaviorally specific incidence measures. We're at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to be respectful and stop.
You can go ahead, Sharon, because I can just keep recording, and then anybody who does need to get off, you can always request a copy of the recording from me.
Great. The next thing I think that is really important is just building in that values-based recognition of what we're trying to do. We want to support survivors, but we want to stop perpetration. So, we need to know how many survivors are on our campus so that we can allocate resources to support them and know how many people are walking around on our campus. And it's a really great measure to demonstrate a problem is happening on campus and that we need to think about this. In terms of really doing prevention that works and finding out whether what you're doing does work or where it's working, how it's working, we want to measure perpetration. So again, if you have a behaviorally specific items, instead of saying, did you experience this, you say, have you done this to anyone? Or, have you done this at any point in the last, I'm not phrasing that exactly right, but there's ways of phrasing it where you're asking people if they were the actor or the responsible party. You can see that so in this case, the gray bars are the pre, and the yellow and red bars are the post for each of these individual sexual harassment behaviors. Whether or not it's under reporting of perpetration, people don't want to admit that they did it, or another likely explanation would be that there's fewer perpetrators offending against multiple people. If each bully bullies 7 people, you could still have the red bars and the yellow bars show the pattern that they are. Generally, you will see that perpetration measures are going to be a little bit, they're not going to be as high as your victimization measure. So it is important to understand the difference, and both of those data are really, really useful. But in terms of those of us doing work to figure out what is the behavior associated with perpetration and how do we stop that, it becomes more and more important, I think, to think about what's the language that's going to work to, get perpetrators acknowledging and reporting their behavior, seeing the behavior, having other people be able to see what perpetration looks like, because that's what we ultimately need to change to eliminate sexual misconduct. So again, it's possible, and it's really, really useful to sometimes combine victimization and perpetration. Last thing I want to just point out is that there's big discussions about whether you should use single item indicators versus scales, or like multiple items that kind of get at the idea of connectedness. For example, we know that being connected to your school is a protective factor that serves to prevent sexual misconduct. Feeling included, those things are protective factors that we want to measure to see how our campuses are doing in terms of promoting those things. It's hard to measure there's lots of different ways of asking that. So often, and you'll hear me say it when, in regards to developing evaluation tools, you want at least 3 items kind of getting at the same idea. And then the best thing to do is to combine those items and get a scale measure. And that is true. It's easier to see change with if you have more than one item to look at, and especially if you combine them into scales. That's not something that SurveyMonkey can just do for you. In order to combine 4 items on a SurveyMonkey survey into a scale, you have to use SPSS to go through all the cases and figure out what to do with missing data, and figure out, even if you're just calculating an average, what's your numerator and what's your denominator. If you're doing it for hundreds and hundreds of students and hundreds of variables, it can get to be a lot of work. And then once you have those scales, what they're most useful for, they're really good inputs into parametric statistics because they constitute interval level data. So I'm getting really geeky here, but the point that I want to make is while they're kind of gold standard, and you'll hear me talking about them as best practice, single item indicators are also really, really, really good tools. And almost all of those examples that I just gave you purposely were single item indicators. So you can use single item indicators as a really good place to start for now. What becomes important is that if you're not running them through parametric statistics, then what signifies a meaningful change is somewhat arbitrary. Anybody could pick whatever number, and that's where, again, and maybe I can somehow circle this into a closing, is that what that difference, so what you would do is, let's say it's percentages, you'd plot your distributions, you'd look at percentage, what percentage of people agreed with a statement at pre, what percentage agreed with a statement at post, you'd look at the difference, how big that difference is to constitute, yes, we had the change that we wanted to have, is going to be arbitrary. But it's going to be something that you decide, and that's where your values come in. And again, so that I wanted to make the nice, neat wrap up of your evaluation needs to be guided by your values, and you have a lot of decisions to make in terms of driving the process, interpreting the results, and taking action on those findings. And thank you. I'm here and always happy to have people reach out via any one of these platforms, whether it's phone, text, email, or commenting on my website, blog. All of those are great ways to connect with me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. And I have not seen any content-related questions come in. For those of you who are still a part of our webinar right now, a recording of the webinar will be made available. Simply just email me. I provided my contact information, and Sharon has so generously also provided you with her contact information. If you do have some specific questions related to the content or material she presented today, if you want to reach out to her, I'm sure she'll be happy to provide some feedback or thoughts or answer any of those questions as they come up. So thank you again, Sharon, for being willing to do that and for doing this second webinar for us. Really appreciative, as always, of your contributions, not only to this work that we're doing with the Changing Campus Culture Initiative, but really across the U.S. For all the work that you do to help us end sexual violence. So thank you so much. That's it, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, and take care. Bye.